book that we're going to discuss today is an edited volume that is a welcome contribution that focuses on knowledge production under conditions of exile for scholars who have been displaced from their home academic context. And it raises a series of incredibly important questions, not just about the conditions of exile and the conditions of knowledge production and what value displaced scholars bring, but also the conditions of the academic context they find themselves in and the nature of intellectual community, and frankly, oftentimes the failures of solidarity and the failures to be able to engage in meaningful intercultural and intercivilizational dialogue that is exemplified by the forms of exclusion that exiled scholars find themselves having to navigate. So the transition to the new professional context, which is frequently thought of as a transition that needs to be made by the displaced scholar alone, actually calls into question what it is that we're doing in our own intellectual communities in terms of our openness to different methodologies, different perspectives, different ways of knowing and different ways of theorizing, and exactly how insular, narrow, and oftentimes inward-looking we are. So I'm especially happy, as I've already mentioned, to have a chance to join this event with my friend, Professor Syed Hassan Akhlaq, who has been one of the competitive fellowship recipients of a project that MESA has had, which is called the Global Academy, and of which I'm very proud because it has brought me into community, intellectual community and political community with a range of exiled scholars from everywhere from Afghanistan to Kurdistan, Iran to Libya, and most recently, a large cohort of scholars from Gaza and Sudan. And it has been an enormously enriching and valuable experience in which I have been the one who has been learning and being taught by my colleagues who have joined us in this project. And Syed is one of those, and I'm delighted to have him here with us as one of the co-editors of this important volume. And it's also my great pleasure to have met and to welcome Dr. Alfred Babo, who is the other co-editor who will be presenting today. So I'm just going to read their bios, I believe in the order that they're speaking, with Dr. Babo going first. Dr. Alfred Babo is an associate professor of anthropology and the director of the International Studies program at Fairfield University. Before joining Fairfield, he taught at the University of Bouaké in Côte d'Ivoire, as well as at Smith College and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is an interdisciplinary scholar with expertise in development anthropology, political science, African studies, and refugee studies. He is widely published in peer-reviewed journals and books in the United States, Africa, Europe, and Asia. His current research projects and publications focus on the issue of refugee activism in Africa and acculturation in the United States. He co-founded the initiative Share the Platform to advocate for refugees' self-representation and expertise. And he's also currently a board member of the Scholar at Risk Network. In 2023, he received the Fairfield University 2023 Martin Luther King Vision Award for his engagement with refugees and vulnerable communities. Then our second presenter is Dr. Syed Hassan Akhlaq, who is a philosopher and interdisciplinary scholar currently teaching at Coppin State University. His academic focus centers on philosophy with expertise in comparative studies, the history of ideas, modernity, and colonization. He has held scholarly roles at several universities in the United States, including Princeton, Boston University, George Washington University, and the Catholic University. Prior to his work in the United States, he was active in Iranian and Afghan academia, and his publications span both English and Persian. His personal and academic journey, from religious studies to philosophy, from madrasa to university, and from public engagement to professional scholarship, reflects his deep commitment to amplifying the voices, not only of exiled scholars, but also of those who are engaged in fostering intercivilizational dialogue and understanding. So with this introduction, I will turn the floor over now to Dr. Babo, and we will have an introduction to the volume and a description of the goals and aims, and some readings of excerpts from the volume, which I heartily recommend to all of our audience. And then I will return to co-moderate a Q&A. So with that, please join me in welcoming Drs. Akhlaq and Babo.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. And I would like to really thank the organizers of this event and Yale University and MESA for giving us the opportunity to share a little bit our thoughts and talk about the book. So I arrived here in the United States in 2012 as a refugee scholar coming from Ivory Coast after what we call kind of war in my country, and I was hosted at Smith College in Massachusetts. Northampton, Massachusetts. So that is where I started, I can say, my American scholarship. But before that, I had a previous life, and I was already professor of anthropology and sociology in my country before arriving. And when I joined Fairfield University in 2016, I wasn't a member of Scholars at Risk at that point, and later I became a member of the board. And one of my activities was to try to give kind of opportunity to scholars at risk like me who can, come to my campus. And I organized a week-long stay for Professor Akhlaq, Syed. And then after this first invitation, we became, of course, good friends. And we realized that we sharing some kind of same, difficulties or kind of acculturation problem or issues, not only in the society, but also in our institutions, because we come into a new academic arena and we have to kind of start over or learn everything, again, even if we are educated, right? We have our PhD, we have everything, but we're coming from a different culture and we have to adjust to make this adjustment. So that visit was kind of the departure of this idea for a book. And we had a conversation and we realized that maybe people have been talking about, our colleagues in the field of refugee studies don't have probably the same background that we have and our personal experience. Usually when people want to hear from us, they want to hear the tragic parts of the adventure, right? For many reasons. But this time I thought, and we shared this idea that why we don't reflect on that, on what's happening to us as intellectuals, as scholars, because people tend to see us only as refugees. But are we refugees only, or are we also scholars, right? So how do we navigate this double identity? How do we, manage that when you in your new institution? I'm coming from a country where I did everything in French in Ivory Coast, and I came here starting over learning English and start over my life, as you can imagine. So we shared the same thing, and we thought that we're not only the two of us. Let's try to see if we have other colleagues, who are also going through this kind of experience. We're not talking about immigrants or economic migrants. We're talking about people who have been established sometime in the country, but who are forced to migrate somewhere and who have been saved or protected by some agencies, including Scholars at Risk. How are they navigating things to go back to their career? So we started thinking, how do we write this kind of book? The two of us being editors, having English for our third or fourth language. We probably need someone else, right? Someone, a native English speaker who could be a third editor. So at least we can collaborate that way. And we tried to have someone. He came with us for a couple of meetings, and then this person disappeared, probably disappointed by, the way, so in terms of culture, it's not easy. And we said, okay, what do we do? Do we stop here, or it's a kind of exciting challenge for us? Because someone told us that you two being refugees, being refugee scholars, I don't see you completing this, this project. I don't know how you're gonna do that. So we said, okay, let's try to do that and make it as a challenge to. So we went from 3 editors to the 2 of us. So the book is finally conceived, thought, imagined by 14 refugee scholars. We don't have someone else in that book. So we thought that it would be a kind of unique perspective for us to talk about what we are, navigating, what we're thinking, what we're going through, without someone coming to impair our reflection. That was our goal. So it was for us something we thought would be interesting to do. And as you can see, we have 14 refugee scholars here who are located in the West, basically, in Europe, US, Canada, as you can see. But it's also interesting to see where we're coming from, okay? So it's, as I said, all of us are refugee scholars, and we thought reflect on this book. But we were clear, and Syed will probably insist on that, we're clear on the fact that we're not asking you to come and to complain or to talk about, your difficulties and whatever challenges. We all are going through that, right? But what we want is to show people that beyond being refugees, we are scholars, and we want to reflect on what we're living as experience as, intellectuals. Right, so that's the approach that we used, and we found it very interesting. Even though we have different, in terms of fields, as you can see, we have anthropologists, sociologists, religious people in religious studies, politics, art, and philosophy, and in terms of origin of all contributors from Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire, Afghanistan, Yemen, Ethiopia. So this book is kind of, very rich from that perspective. Both where we live, where we're hosted, we have some kind of experiences there, but also where we're coming from as we make our transition to the Western academia. So that's where, that's kind of context I wanted to present first. Then the second element is really, what are we trying to argue in this book? So the question for us was, as I said, our double identity or dual identity that we cannot get rid of. We are refugees, of course, but we're also scholars. Now, the question is, usually when we relocated in Europe, in US or Canada, it's presented as the, safe haven, right? Coming here to start kind of a new life, very promising. So the question for us, is the safe haven still safe? Right? Is it still safe for us? When we're looking at the political environment, the discriminatory policies that, of course, we want or not, we might be involved in. As an African coming here, I have never questioned the color of my skin in Cote d'Ivoire. But here, I have to think about it. Am I Black in a classroom, right? Or am I just an African? Or am I just a professor of anthropology who's just teaching? But living in the US, I can't avoid this racial, things that I have to reflect on and I have to think through, right? For myself, but also for my kids, okay, my family. So for someone who was just a professor of anthropology in Ivory Coast, I became here Black, and I have to think about this racial theory, okay, and think about that. So those kind of things will be kind of part of what we are thinking of. So, and we have many other things like on the political and economic side. How do we secure a job, a steady job? How do we overcome the language barrier? Okay, if I'm looking for a job, I need good evaluation, but my evaluation will be impacted by my accent, because those young American kids might say they don't understand what I'm saying, and my evaluation will be bad. How do I get a good job with bad evaluation, right? So we have this kind of circle that we have to navigate, we have to deal with. And finally, are we recognized as valid knowledge producers? Okay, so that's kind of a good question for us too. That's what we thought. Are we denied because we're coming from this part of the world, or are we denied our knowledge is not recognized, talent, skills are not recognized because our doctorate is a problem or because we had this doctorate in the countries. But we know that some of us have been part of Western academia, right? We have been in France. I learned in France. I came in the United States even before becoming refugee. I was a winner of a scholarship, and I stayed at UMass after my doctoral degree. So how come sometimes we are integrated in the academic, Western academia, but at the same time, when it comes to have something steady, we like what you presented is not good enough, right? So for some of us will be having a second job, at McDonald's or do something, being taxi drivers because we need to feed our families. So how do we deal with other things? So that's kind of things I would like to highlight briefly in my remarks, and I can just read an excerpt to conclude and give the floor to my colleague, if that's fine. Yeah, so I can compassionate approach to something that's recognize our value, right? We don't want to stay, as Anna Arendt said, we don't want to stay for life refugees. We want to be also recognized as scholars. Okay. So on page 14, I'm reading about the type of duty of rescue. Compassion, generosity, excuse me, sorry, I need my glass.
You can feel free to sit out there if that would be more comfortable.
Oh, no, I'm
okay.
Yeah. Compassion, generosity, and solidarity are principles intrinsically grounded in humanity and human wisdom, and describe the idea of rescue and refuge. However, some scholars argue that the mission and duty of rescue are exceeded when the refugee requires that life be restored as closely as possible to pre-refuge conditions. It is undeniable that by offering a refuge scholar a refuge and an academic job as similar as possible to the pre-refuge situation, high-income countries and Western-based organizations like Scholars at Risk, the Institute for International Education and the Rescue Fund, CARA, POSE, etc., successfully demonstrate compassion and solidarity with researchers and teachers in distress, even exceeding their mission. However, some scholars' assumption relies on the idea of mobility of poor people from poorer countries to more affluent nations, thereby turning refugees into economic migrants. Economic motives may hold even for some of the most educated refugees who may be attracted to and caught by the prospect of significant improvement in their quality of life and academic career. In support of this notion, refugee researchers and professors have the opportunity to be hosted and offer a temporary position in colleges, universities, centers of rich nations. Beyond the refuge, scholar is the intellectual. Refugee scholars are constantly confronted with the need to build and navigate hybrid identities based on the differences between their culture of origin and that of their host country. This identity mutation also occurs on the intellectual and academic front, as many of them must adapt or switch teaching and research fields and expertise. The hybrid construction of refugee scholars' identity as refugees or intellectual, especially in the co-production of knowledge, is framed by Babo in his theory of third space, specifically in the production of transnational knowledge. This knowledge production is often framed by an unequal power relation, finding themselves caught between the global north and global south spaces. Exiled academics adopt conglomerate of positions positions informed by the entangled experiences of language acquisition, racial identity, educational approaches, gender interactions, and fluidity of emotional burden. So I will stop here and give the chance for us to have a conversation, and I can provide more detail if needed. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Okay, great. Thank you, Babo. That was a great introduction. Thank you. I really appreciate my colleague, my friends, and in some way my mentor, Dr. Aslı, for organizing this program, MESO Global Academy. Actually, MESO Global Academy was supported me from the beginning of the project by distributing the call for paper. And right now, I'm happy that we are celebrating the accomplishment of this project. So as my friend Dr. Babo told, the idea came to our mind after meeting and some conversation about shared experiences to find out there is a big paradoxes with regards to refugee scholars. They received some kind of welcome and acknowledgement because being kind of elites, educated people, and have done some sacrifice for the academic freedom, for the freedom of the speech, for many, many other things. So, but at the same time, they think they looked some way as a refugee, that we are not going into detail deep about the conversation that is mentioned in the book about humanitarianism, that even acknowledging and receiving a refugee as a refugee from the top-down perspective, to look at those people are needy, they need help, and some of them, like scholars, they deserve more help, or primary help, or the basic helps, and so that's one element. Another element is that their knowledge. Mostly we in this book ask a scholar who been established scholar in their origin countries, and they came here, and their knowledge, their production of the knowledge is forgotten. It just became a title. So they acknowledge they were doctors, they were intellectual, they were educated, they were professor, but here is just a respectful refugee. That's it. So how to deal with these two things? Receive welcome and receive kind of the ignoring and lack of the acknowledging their knowledge productions. So to do that, as we heard, we sent a call for papers, and we received many from different scholars. First, we thought maybe even some people encourage us that we can have 2 volumes, but when we received the detail, we just find out that it doesn't meet the things that we are looking for. What we were looking for, autoethnography, and a person write down their own intellectual journey in connected with the previous refugee scholars. So we didn't want them to just tell us their own personal stories, because it was not an autobiography text. We wanted them to put their stories to show us how they see when they compare themselves with their previous generations, or what kind of differences they see. Actually, part of the book starts with a kind of compilation on the We Refugee, written by Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt, we know that she discussed about the topics that how a person when moved to another country try to find a clear concept of themselves. But the shocking point was that after many decades, we just found out that the problem are not solved, but maybe found some other aspects. Because Hannah Arendt, for example, was curious that a person who moves loses their own national identity, and in new country, their national identity is not acknowledged. They're trying to adjust with the new nations. But we had a scholar who lived a generation that they didn't believe in national identity that government imposed on them. So the scholar believed that they are not sure if they had any national identity. They were forgotten throughout history. And that added to the layer of the adaptations and how the new and target community look at them. However, so we asked them to ponder on these kind of things, and three particular questions were important. One is that about transnational knowledge productions. So they came mostly from different paradigmic of the knowledge productions, and they needed to do it. They used to consider different questions, different challenges, different target community, and they needed to change all these kind of things. How they navigate this change, and sometimes as a scholar, they needed to work at the same time in different areas. So they work here as an academic in Western academia with the questions that are important here, but they are from, for example, Afghanistan or Iran or from Bosnia, so they have to consider there because they were established people there. They have something for these people. People are looking after them and asking them, and sometimes they see themselves as a role models for young generation there. So they want to do something for them too. So at the same time, how they negotiate between these two kind of things. That's one thing that I will get back to that more. The second question was a mobility within academic mobility. So here we're living by here I mean the West. So the academia is the area of the mobility. So we just learn new things, new methodology, new question, new challenges, and new approaches. But a refugee scholar, as my colleague just told that, in the safe haven, maybe they are stuck in the situation. They cannot travel, they cannot contribute, cannot go to the conferences, they cannot find market for their research topics. They cannot move in the area of the mobility. And the last question was particularly at risk scholars, how they navigate the academic navigate to academic job markets. So mostly they were established. Right now they have to start from the scratch. The issue of the identity and diversity, all these kind of things. So we received many things that, as I told you, some of them didn't meet this kind of the specific questions and the background that needs to be studied. And finally, we ended up with 14 contributors. So again, if I want to briefly look at the content of the book, I can say a few points. Point number one, here is again emphasis on the conflict between humanitarianism and intellectualism. So humanitarianism, look at the refugee scholar as a refugee who needs to be saved. But intellectual is a person who has their own integrity, intellectual integrity. They have their own original contributions. They have their own voice. They want to share that one. So mostly refugee scholar in this book, they share that from humanitarian perspective, even there are some challenges with that, but regardless of that point. So they receive some kind of the receptions, but from intellectual perspective, their intellectual background mostly were ignored or were not acknowledged. However, that's one important point that we are talking about. That another point that was very important, refugee scholar in this book wanted to move between two opposite ends. So as a scholar, they needed to talk objectively, but they themselves were the subject of the topic. So they needed to talk about themselves. So at the same time, be a subject and an object. So that was a little unique and challenging issue to be self and other at the same time. And we think the scholar did that great job. That's good, provide a good example for this kind of the autoethnography. So one issue that is a very touch in this book is the issue of the identity. So how they were perceived, how they understand themselves, because in the Western academia, they just needed to re-examine and re-question their identities. As established scholars, they had established a clear identity, but here, so who we are, how we deal with the new academia and new world, and how others understand us, and how to respond to their conception of us. So they needed to deal with all this kind of the question related to their identities. Another challenge that they are talking in this book is, so when we look at academia from the outside, as the outsider, of course, the issue of the meritocracy, the integrity of the university or academia is important. But when somebody come into the academia, they will find out that they have to forget perfectionism. So there is a lot of ups and downs. And for some of them are integral to the identity of the academia. So for example, academic paradigms. We have a scholar who came from Ukraine. So she grew up in a culture, in academia, that look at society. Their perspective of sociology was completely influenced with the kind of the close to the critical thinking, critical theory, but completely different paradigm. When she moved to Switzerland, she needed to forget all this perspective and just embrace new perspective that maybe she doesn't feel comfortable with that. Yeah, personally, I have my own stories to give you some example. For example, so I did my PhD in philosophy, comparison between Islamic philosophy, pre-pathetic Islamic philosopher, and Enlightenment philosopher of the 18th century of the Europe. So if you look at the tradition of the philosophy in Islam, so there are big names everybody knows, like Avicenna, Averroes, and like that. And I did my work, most of my work on Averroes. As a philosopher in Islam, we know philosopher and philosophy in Islam has some intellectual enemy, including Imam Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah. But when I moved to the US, I just learned that Ibn Taymiyyah is a philosopher. I have to change in American perspective. So I have to change, I have to forget Avicenna, I have to forget Averroes, I have to forget Farabi, I have to forget Kennedy, and I have to prove to the academia here that I'm an expert of the Ibn Taymiyyah. That was very shocking. Enemy of it. Always I'm saying, even Ghazali, he's not, if he has the feeling, so he's not feeling good in his grave to hear he's a philosopher. But everybody in the West is saying he was a very great philosopher. So that means that as a scholar, so I have to change all paradigm of the looking at some things. The structure and culture of the academia here is a completely different than the structure and culture of the academia there. And as I said, also transnational knowledge to do at the same time work for here and for there. Another interesting point that we arrive at in this book is paradoxes of the modernity, modernization, and post-colonialism. Many scholars who moved from east to the west, so they grew up in academia that in some way connected with the colonizing power. So they established this academy. And then when they come here, so they have to, particularly with the new development here, with the new, with the post-colonialism, with the critical theory and something like that. So they have to look critically, in some way negatively, at the institution that provide them chance to grow up. And then here also, so they coming to a colonizing country. So multi layers of the paradoxes of the where they studied, how they look at their study, institution of the knowledge, and where they are right now, accepted and get support, and how to look at this institution, all these kind of things. So another point, connected point with this is I would like to say in this way. So when they're coming here, they're not just a scholar coming here. They are a scholar who carrying a history with themselves coming here. And neither their scholarship nor their histories are actually acknowledged, and even they need to look back at their histories and redefine and re-understand their histories as new target university wanted, not as they are. But let's say give you another example that's to be a little, it's a shocking, but you can't believe it, but it's a sad reality. When I came here, I know that this is, first of all, I changed my focus from philosophy to religion, because some of the established scholars told me in the US, people are not buying philosophy. So if you want to go to the market, go for religion and Islam. And that time, because of all the issues in Middle East, everybody was interested in Islamism, Islamist group, militant Islam, and like that. I got a book, Encyclopedia of Islamists, published by Columbia University. So very specific topic, very acknowledged university. I got it, I look at the entries, I found some entries there that was shocking. None of them are Islamists, but some established Islamists are not mentioned there. To give you an example from my home country, Afghanistan. So there was a general, was a communist, because he was known as a communist general. So, but finally, because of the political play, he changed, he came close to the Islamists because of his ethnic background, not because of the religious or anti-religious background. His name is Rashid Dussan. His name was in this book as an Islamist person, but the person who was responsible for changing the political system of Afghanistan from democratic republic to Islamic, was in Shia context Ayatollah Sheikh Asif Musini. His name was not in the book. So it means that if I'm talking about Ayatollah Musini and I write a paper, people who are reviewing my paper, they say, who is this guy? He doesn't know what he's talking about. I have to write down about Dussum or some people that acknowledge as an Islamist group. So that means that there is a, when I'm looking at the history of Afghanistan, history of my country, I have to change my approach to my history, focus which one group if I look for the market, not what is reality. That's something that we as exiled scholar are dealing with that. As I said, as a scholar, so we needed to move at the same time toward different directions. So because we don't know which one will find markets, right? So I have to show that I'm a philosopher, I'm a Islamologist, I'm at the same time a scholar of the religion, maybe intercultural study. I have to publish on all area. Maybe one of them works, right? But in some way, it's a lot of load on my shoulders. But at the same time, it signals that he is the guy that touches everything, right? He's not real scholars. So I have to deal with all these paradoxes and at the same time do with all these things, plus my personal question, plus my family, plus my extended family and families and relatives and like that. Another point that I think is maybe a last point that before I read some excerpt, I would like to share is that one interesting point that we got from the contribution of the contributor in this book, they suggesting to re-examine some critical concept that we think we know them. Of course, with regard to to the humanitarianism, the concept of the saving and helping. So there are a lot of literature about that. I don't want to go about that. The concept of the knowledge and knowledge productions, what we consider knowledge production. Is it just teaching in Western academia? It's just publishing in Western academia? So to give you an example, I delivered for a couple of months a series of lecture in Catholic University of America. So it was received well. Finally, I didn't know how to publish. I wanted to make a book of that and publish it. I sent to a publisher. After like a year, they told me so I have to make it like a double side that it has. So, and I had no time for that. So we just cut the relationship, and I didn't know what to do. One of my friend who was refugee long time ago, a few decades ago, he introduced me a self-publishing company and said, okay, publish there. So I was curious. I had no any idea. I approached this company, and then I connected one of my friend in George Mason University, and he was my friend. He knows my scholarship. Always he supported me. He used to tell me, if you need endorsement, just let me know. I just connected him and asked him to do endorsement. And he asked me which publisher it is. And I just told him, and he said, say you don't publish, so you'll ruin your academic reputation. And I told him, John, I don't know any publisher. I have no time. I have a lot of personal, family, so refugee status. I cannot focus on that. But I need some publication in English. And he said, no publication is better than self-publications. So that means that we don't consider those kind of publication knowledge productions. But some people publish there, and for a scholar who comes, they see sometimes that people who were knowledgeable in their areas or in their in their field, so they publish there. So they have this kind of the problem. They don't know what is knowledge, what is considered knowledge production, what is not, what is the production. So they talk a little about that. Deeper form of that is a paradigm of the knowledge production that I just referred to that. And the last thing is about the concept of the diversity. So particularly this tough time that is under attack. So a scholar came with this idea that always when we think of the diversity, we think of the race, we think of the maybe language, we think of the color of the people who comes to the departments, but they think we have to consider a different paradigm of the knowledge productions, a style of the writing, methodology of the research, and particularly different perspectives that refugee scholars bring with themselves. So I think we need that. So one thing is that Western academia needs to acknowledge the way that they look at themselves. So we heard a lot about the problem of the Orientalism and other forms of the related to colonizations of the knowledge. One way to overcome that is to acknowledge the way that people look at themselves and understand their histories and understand their way of their culture. So because we have, I talked a lot, I just want to read two paragraphs just to share something from the critiques. So 5. Contributor to this volume delve into how personal life challenges intervene with emotional upheavals and cultural adaptations, serve as a framework for analyzing academic work and career while in exile, employing a range of the methodologies, primarily rooted in qualitative, comparative, cross-cultural perspectives, and autoethnography. They reassess the intersection of self and society within social contexts. These scholars demonstrate their adaptability by generating transnational knowledge relevant to both their host and home countries, navigating multiple languages, and adhering to diverse academic and publishing norms. Through their work, they challenge and enrich the academic landscape, contributing to a broader understanding of global issues while bridging cultural divides, continuing to write and publish in their native or previously established academic languages. Exiled scholars enrich the dialogue among culture and civilization, creating an intellectual melting pot that transcends globalizations and superficial multiculturalism. And the last phrase, we demonstrated the multi-layered nature of the exiled scholars, which defied any singular narratives, no matter how empathetic or scholarly objectives was not solely to characterize or criticize. Instead, by sharing the life and work experiences of exiled scholars, we reject the notion that merely highlighting the flaws of the current world is sufficient to usher in a new one. So the contributors to this volume write autoethnography with a forward-looking perspective, unafraid to address issues such as immobility within academic mobility and the reduction of exiled scholars to a single aspect, while also proposing ways to undo these challenges. They recount stories of neglect while simultaneously advocating for re-evaluations of the transnational knowledge production. It is recognized that if we fail to re-examine our analysis, we deceive ourselves about our identity, beliefs, and teaching. This demonstrates how the subjects themselves can speak for their experiences and illustrate their contributions to transnational knowledge production. Thank you.
Great, I'm going to join you now. And I might kick off our Q&A with a couple of questions myself, but maybe I'll do one and then we'll see if there's some from the audience and then I'll continue. I have so many and I just so enjoyed listening to this. This was really fantastic. So thank you for the presentations and for reading the excerpts and giving us a sense of the book. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about the call that you sent out and what kind of theoretical framework or what kinds of questions you were asking people to engage with. And so what distinguished those contributions that met the bar from those that didn't? This idea of autoethnography, for example, I find that fascinating. And I wonder if that was something that was legible to the people that, I mean, if it's a language that you used in the call, if people understood readily what kinds of work would qualify. And also the use of arent is also extremely interesting but still presumes a certain kind of disciplinary training to have, that's a very social science frame. It's not, of course, people in the humanities also use arent, but yeah, legal studies, for example, it wouldn't necessarily be obvious. So I just wondered how you framed the theoretical questions you were asking people to engage. And if you had a shared framework that the two of you had already discussed and elaborated so that they had some sense what they were reacting to.
Okay, so the call for paper was a detailed call, actually. So one of the comment that we received at the beginning is that to shorten it because it was 2 pages. So we gave some kind of the detail to our audiences, gave them kind of the literature about that to be aware of that because they maybe they had no time to read about that or they were not aware of it. So we provide some literature, the list of the literature to look at them and to see if they can connect themselves to this literature and add something to them. So that was the main point. Of course, we'll leave that open to their approaches. Interdisciplinary was important for us. Autoethnography that was very important. so cultural, cross-cultural studies. So we just wanted to not limit them to go with one way because it couldn't work. So we just told them these are area and touch, but you have to relate your own journey with this literature and with the three questions that we said about the transnational production of the knowledge, mobility within immobility within mobility, and being a scholar at risk, how to navigate at job academics. So yeah, focusing on these three questions, looking at this literature and finding which approach or which methodology works for them and on.
Yeah, I think it was a very interesting period of exchange with all those who would send an abstract, because they wanted to be part of the adventure, but for many of them, it was hard to frame what they wanted, their story, into something, into the literature. So I can say it didn't stop, our editing work did not stop just after the selection of the abstracts. We had to work with them even after the first draft and send comment back to insist to say, we want all the things that you're discussing here to be framed into the literature. So that is how you will be showing, no matter your discipline, but it needs to be framed into the literature. So it can give this intellectual, characteristics that we're looking for. It's not just to tell a story, right? Because this kind of, as I said, this kind of story, people have already heard about that, right? That's one thing. The second thing is, how can you bring a kind of critical perspective into what you're writing? As Sayed was saying, how do you put yourself as a researcher with you being the subject and object at the same time? So try that. Look everything that you're just writing about from the researcher perspective, from the researcher, position, and bring this critical approach to what you're writing. So that's how we work. I can say, obviously, from the call for paper to throughout all the process, that's what we did.
Yeah. So maybe I add something more. So first, we receive a lot of abstract proposal. So we were curious to ask them to focus on one of these three things. So because we wanted to be more specific and detail oriented, but we just found out that nobody can focus on one of them. So they want to touch on all these three aspects: knowledge productions, immobility within mobility, and also as a scholar at risk. And that caused us to change the format of the book and even the format of the chapters or sections of the text. So we didn't divide into multiple sections. That was our first plan, and we acknowledged their experiences. So they were not able because they wanted to study themselves. They didn't. If they wanted to study something else, they could find a lot of things, right? But about themselves, they had one story about transnational knowledge productions. Another was about how they. But still, some scholar with some aspects more than others. For example, we have Ukrainian scholars that they shared more on the issue of how to deal with the crisis with the identity, and particularly with the stress and anxiety, and they came with some recommendation specific to the scholar, how to deal with that, how to learn to deal with the anxiety in new academia and share it with the other scholars.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I have some follow-ups on that, but I'm going to pause for a second to see if there are other questions before I'm happy to delve into more myself. Yeah, Brad, please.
I'm a little curious about the institutions where the contributors are. Is there a range? Are we talking all Ivy League? Are there people at community colleges, land grant colleges? Do you have the variety of the experiences there? Can
And
you-
by the way, several are not in the United States. They're also European. based in
yeah, which
in
is,
Canada.
Canada, yeah.
But please, go ahead.
That's really interesting. One thing we can say is that what could be interesting is that by the time you start the project and when you start the project and by the time you finish the project, some of them have changed institutions, they have changed positions, they have changed, you know. So it was interesting when we reached the last point and the publisher was asking the final, affiliation. You know, some started with one specific affiliation, and as I said, at the end, they had to give a different affiliation. So yeah, some started as being member of a laboratory somewhere in Germany, and when we finished, he was pursuing a research career somewhere in another center in France.
so most of them are in Europe?
Not most of them. I don't
We
know
had a
if-
slide at the
we
beginning
had a
that
slide with-
listed all the countries of origin and countries of location now.
Yeah. But we do have people in contributors in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, for Europe, in France, in
Okay,
UK, and I think the rest, most of the
North America.
North America, Canada, and the US.
Yeah, I can tell the
But I
exact.
don't believe that we have once with teaching at the community college. Sidin is called teaching at community college. But what is interesting is really how she navigated to how she worked hard to try to have a position, even kind of adjunct position in college, at the university. But finally, you have to make, after years of battle, you have to make a decision for yourself, for your own mental health, right? You have to make a decision and say, okay, I'm good here. I can still contribute at a community college, even if I've been pursuing a position at the university. Obviously, she tried everything. She did a number of applications. I think we even asked her to remove that part because she was trying to give the number of applications she went through. And I said, okay, yeah, but that's not really what we want to see is what is behind that, right? Because we all have been, we have applied a lot of numerous time, but this is not particular to refugee scholars. Even young American students coming, pursuing PhD, they just have the PhD, they're also applying as us. So we should not think that we need a special treatment because we're refugee. That's not the point we're making here. So number of applications goes for all of us. Young, just those who just got the PhD, old like us, coming from somewhere, native citizens, we all are applying for positions, right? So that's not a big deal. That's not, something. But what we want you to think is how this number of applications is informing your scholarship or your reflection. Right, your theoretical and empirical reflection. That's what we wanted you to reflect on. So we do have some who have those kind of positions. Some are still not very attached in terms of steady position. They're still member of a team, researcher team. I don't know for the Sivitana in
Switzerland.
She's at the Institute of Graduate Institute of in Geneva.
Geneva.
Yeah. But I don't think that is a very steady position. She's like an associate researcher or something like that. So that's kind of our fate, but it should not prevent us from continuing to work and to look for a position.
Yeah, a whole sub theme here is the political economy of knowledge production and of the academy, which itself is shifting even under our feet as we are trying to navigate these environments and narrowing overall globally in the humanities and social sciences, which is its own separate challenge relative to, for example, displaced scholars in the natural sciences, where some of the challenges pertain, some of the challenges don't pertain. I was struck by how much I co-edited 2 volumes, and in both cases, the goal was to have a truly transnational conversation. So these were projects in comparative law, but the goal was to identify scholars working on that particular jurisdiction within the jurisdiction. So if we were doing a project on Iraq, someone in Iraq working on that question in law, et cetera, which raised some of the similar challenges, like different disciplinary and perspectival. We were welcoming that, we wanted that, but it meant as an editor, I would look at friends who were co-editing a volume or editing a volume, and they would basically come up with an idea that they're interested in, invite their friends for a conference, everybody sends in the papers, book is finished in 12 months, and they're the editor. And in my case, it was like non-native English speakers, people from completely different disciplinary backgrounds and trainings, like marshaling that work into a book is actually a microcosm of the very thing you're studying. Because you're saying, look, honestly, there are very different cultural prerequisites around knowledge production, and even within the same discipline, anthropology or philosophy in the example that you gave maybe mean something quite different in terms of disciplinary preparation in different jurisdictions. And then, the illegibility of that and transcending that when everybody claims they are interested in global studies or intercultural dialogue or transnational knowledge production, but when push comes to shove, they want everybody to come from the same training at the same handful of American universities, et cetera. And when it's not like that, it's very difficult to actually manage. But then in a weird way, so this is winding up to a question, as you had 2 things that you said that struck me. One was the experience with a co-editor that abandoned the project. So that's something I did not experience. And I want to invite you to reflect on that itself as an instance of, again, the thing that you're studying. Like, I almost hope that there's an introduction or something that you've co-authored that actually addresses that fact without necessarily naming the person, what that is illustrative of, because there's also, a sort of investment in co-knowledge production that I think is necessary. Like, the answer to your experience, Syed, of the Dostom encyclopedia entry is not you changing your work. It should be you co-authoring with the kind of person that would write that encyclopedia entry, a completely different, like almost a dialogue that explains how we can have such different understandings of the same empirical and overcome that difference by, engaging with one another. That's the ideal way that this should proceed. It should be research collaboration with exiled scholars understood to not only, as you say, be experts, but also literal human archives of knowledge derived from a different, empirical and perspectival epistemological setting. That would be the ideal. And instead you try to get something off the ground and the co-editor disappears. So that's an interesting thing to reflect on in itself. But the other thing is the degree to which you yourselves perform some of the function of requiring people to engage with a discipline in a particular way, requiring them to fit themselves in to a particular theoretical paradigm. So like the very thing that the disciplinary mechanisms of the academy is doing to you in your navigation, you yourselves are doing as editors. So good to reflect a little bit on the sort of meta level of your own experience of imposing those constraints.
That's true. That's what I said. Sometimes the integral part of the academic work, right? So knowledge production has its limits. So that's the limits that you say. You're right, because we were afraid that if we are not asking them to limit themselves to some approaches or some disciplines, then reviewer will reject it, and publisher will reject it. So because of that, we limit our colleagues, unfortunately. You're right. With regard to the third editor, actually, we received multiple interest letters. Many people, and then when we reviewed all of them, we find this one the best one because he had some kind of the backgrounds in work on refugees. So we look at the backgrounds, and he showed a lot of enthusiasm, interest, and they said, okay, this has enough background. It's a good academic background and background in the field as activists, both. So that was a great asset for us. Because of that, we said no to others and we'll say to this one. And he came for 1, 2, 3, and then just disappeared. We sent him multiple times email that because we are refugee, always we are afraid something new happens. So maybe something happens to your health. please at least reply to us and say you are not anymore interested. But he didn't reply, even to the personal question. So,
Yes, please, go ahead.
So I have a question. My question is like, you have talked at the beginning that maybe like you'll have that insecurity of like, oh, my accent could affect like, my evaluation or like, the feedback from the students. But also like you have talked about you have to change the way you describe things, like talking about things with the language that perhaps now you feel like your audience did change. But isn't it like really just dangerous, like, because here we have the bigger publishers and those are the people really like, they have probably like, bigger outreach. And then we have just one perspective and one way of describing things and we change to adapt, but also we don't bring the variety and the experience that we have from where we come from. And then we can like, there are things that's just, it's the right thing to change for the audience, accent, language, like, for access, but also the different perspectives. So if I would love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, I think uniformity versus diversity is something we always need to consider when we have this kind of reflection. And during the presentation, the first presentation we had of the book 2 weeks ago, I was saying, for example, one of the puzzled question we had was some of the contributors, and of course us, was how do we criticize a system that is saving us, or that saved us, that protected us? So as scholars, you have the academic freedom to challenge something, right? But at the same time, how do you do that when you know that you will be, applying, or you'll be kind of, still looking for these kind of agencies, institutions to, so that is the intellectual position. Should I go for a self-censorship because I want to be hired in the Western academia? Or should I be honest to say the way you guys are doing things, I can, as an intellectual, I can criticize that. So that's what we did as editors. We thought that we were kind of courageous enough to even talk about some kind of, agencies, including scholars at risk. For example, this guy was able to to sue the US government while he was still asking for asylum. So that's a position to be courageous enough to say, I'm suing you for not doing what you're supposed to do, but I'm still asking for my right to be recognized as, as an asylee in the US. So that kind of position is not always everyone who can do that. Some of the contributors asked us when we were going for the review process. They said, that's the book. My chapter is, in my chapter, I'm criticizing some way of working of my host institution. What about my safety if, because we don't know where the publisher would send the book for review, right? Let's say it goes to someone from my institution, seeing my name and their own institution, I'm killing myself. And we said, okay, don't worry, what we will do, we will remove. So that's the work we did. We sat down, we made anonymous everything, we removed the names of people, we removed the name of senders, all those things before sending the book out for review, for peer review. So people could feel safe, because if I'm at Smith College and I'm criticizing the way Smith College is, doing things, of course, if they say someone from Smith College will receive the book for review, I don't know at what, how I'm exposing myself. So this kind of things you're right. To extend this reflection is how are we going toward a kind of a uniform way of thinking? That's your question, because we are in Western academia, but I think if we keep these transnational production skills, we still have the chance, to confront what we have in here with our continuous work we're doing, for subject related to our country of origins. So we're not going for something, that's uniformity, because we have the chance to confront with something else. That we still always bringing some contradiction, some diverse perspective in our work and the way we're reflecting. That's my way of seeing things. And I think that our contributors have understood that. So some of them were able to, critically say some stuff on the agencies that help them, on the institutions where they are right now. Not bad thing, but what I'm saying is being able to criticize to show some limitation, right? Maybe if you have done this, it would have been, it would have been better, not only for me, but for next generation of refugees who will be coming hosted in the institution. That's what I can say. If you want to add something, but
No, that's it.
One thing I was struck by as I was listening to you and the account of hybridity and identity is that first it made me wish that you would jointly maybe co-author an article for peer review beyond the book, just on the theoretical insights you have that are beyond Arendt. And like what can be added, like reading Arendt, like a half century later and from that very different perspective. So one of the things you named, for example, you Alfred mentioned the idea of arriving and now having to be a Black academic, or suddenly having to be interpreted through race in a way that just would have not been the present in Côte d'Ivoire. And I find when we were working with our with scholars from the MENA region, you're a Muslim scholar. I mean, of course you're Muslim, like that's a given, right, wherever you were, but it wasn't an important part of your intellectual identity at all, necessarily, like even because it was a default identity in the Muslim majority world. Like you're not the Muslim scholar who's an Islamolog, it's like you're an Islamolog, and that's all there is, right? And then suddenly you have to be this way. But then also you made the point that like even the national identity that's called into question may be the wrong national identity. And we've had this experience with Kurdish scholars who are seen as Turkish or Iranian. They don't even identify with the category they're now being shoved into. In fact, like much of the condition that led them to exile is the rejection, the fact that they were excluded from that category in the home context, and now they're compulsorily marshaled into that category here. And so there are just, I think, insights that you raised just in the course of the early presentation of the book that I think could stand alone as a political theoretical contribution. But anyway, I mean, to wind this up into a question beyond inviting you to write more together or to continue along these lines, I wonder how, I think it's very different to have a Ukrainian scholar, reflect on this than scholars that really do get raced, that get framed as completely other, right? The story of Ukrainian exile has been a story of they're just like us. I mean, that has been the reception narrative. And then for everyone else, it's just like, how dare they? They're economic migrants, and they look just like all the people we're trying to raise the walls against. So that division I thought is interesting. And I wonder if you saw differences in how your contributors navigated this particular question around hybridity that you were raising around identity.
I think maybe the attention that the Ukrainian refugees, not only the attention, but also all the protective measures that have been taken by Western government, maybe gave the Ukrainian refugee scholars the idea that they will be having a special treatment when they come to Canada or to the US or in Europe. And what we reading in this in the chapters that we received from our colleagues in Ukrainian colleagues is kind of not disappointment, but it's kind of, this is not what we were kind of expecting based on the way the attention and the treatment we received to be hosted very quickly with some policies, say, special policies to host When for some others, it takes years sometimes to be relocated, for the resettlement. But for them, it was very quick. And some people gave money, a lot of donors who were supportive of Ukrainian refugees, and they created some specific programs in some universities to say, my money, I want that money to go to this program to welcome Ukrainian refugees, whether it's physician, anthropologist or whatever, but I want my money to go toward that. But that's one point. The second point is that even when one author said, even after being welcomed the way they were welcomed, it did not make the trauma of refuge disappear, right? You will still be dealing with adjustments to the Western academia. How do you stand in the classroom? How do you speak? How do you, interact with your colleagues? How all those things will not disappear because you have been well, treated to come very quickly to the US or to Europe or to Canada. So what we're experiencing as refugee scholars, some of them will still go through that. And that was the very interesting part of that, themselves recognizing that I was well treated, I was welcomed, but I'm still very anxious. I'm still going through this trauma for myself, for my husband, for my wife, or for my kids. So I understand others trying to navigate that, even in terms of language. One sent us some terms and citations, all in Ukrainian. And the publisher said, we cannot use that. So the challenge for her was translation. So we say, here we are. That's what we all are going through. We have to navigate, we have to translate things. How do you write something you want to say in your language, but you have to say that in English, right? So some of them acknowledged that this anxiety of translation, this anxiety of speaking correct English, right, was something we all were sharing. That's kind of things I can say to answer your question.
And then maybe on the other side of it, I would say you noted that difficulties of now navigating the politics of diversity as the West generally, US in particular, but West generally becomes less and less welcoming, but also has a absolutely reactionary backlash against a very brief moment of racial justice uprising in 2020. So like the time of your book, of course, you began this project way before the second Trump administration, but already when you began the first Trump administration, some of the right-wing developments in Europe were already afoot. So do you see differences or commonalities in the presentations you have in trying to navigate this changing context in the West?
Yeah, I can say, for example, in Europe, that's something which started long before, right? Especially in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in Germany, scholars who were already there were experiencing, after the Syrian refugee crisis, they were already experiencing this right-wing, and the rise of extremism in France, for example, with the National Front. So all kind of move, and of course the Brexit is kind of this nationalism of UK saying, okay, Europe, you want to host those refugees, you stay there, and making the laws more difficult for refugees. So all these anti-refugee, anti-immigration policies were kind of, I would say, legitimized by Trump one, right? Because something were kind of, some people were presenting, because it's in Europe, they were presenting with some kind of humanity behind, or another perspective were allowed. When Trump one came and say it's fine, right? It's okay to say we don't want you, or to say to someone, go back to your country. So some of one author with Ethiopian talk a little bit about that, and he conducted some survey. And for him, it was revealing when he heard that some immigrants were challenging and against refugees. So that was something really interesting for him to see that how come some refugees, some immigrants coming from somewhere else themselves are against or are for anti-immigration, anti-refugee policies. So as intellectuals, it was very interesting for him to see that. So I can say that this environment was prevalent in Europe with the rise of the right wing and the extremist movement there. But in the US here, as I said, for some people like me, the racial theories will be kind of coming and will be embedded into discriminatory, things, whether it's institutional or not, until Trump won. And then we started being, very careful about what can I say in the classroom, what I cannot say in the classroom. Right? How do I deal with my students about racial issues or homosexuality when I'm coming from a background where, for me, these are issues that we don't discuss, or I'm coming from a country where it's still something problematic or controversial. But here I am in a country or in an institution where I have to talk about a gay marriage, or I have to teach about, gay rights. How do I approach that? How do I approach gender issues? All those kind of things. So those are issues that we have to face at some point, and that is part of the way the political environment is influencing our research or our teaching. That's and for now, we don't know yet how Tom 2 will, if we will go for a second volume with, I know that.
Yeah.
But it's something that we have still to think about. But it's part of who we are.
So I think we have come to the end of our time. I extended us a little bit because we started late,
Yeah.
but it has been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. I'm so excited